Right, we're now at the top of the hour. So hello, everyone. And if you're just joining us, welcome. Please do continue to introduce yourselves in the chat with your name, country, and organization. So I welcome you. I am Professor Andrea Rother. I'm head of the Environmental Health Division at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. And I welcome you to this chemicals network, which we run through the division, and we run with kind funding and support from Sweden through the Swedish Chemicals Agency. We also have Dr. Natasha Lalou in the background, who will be providing technical and administrative support. If you do have any technical issues, we have a WhatsApp group that has been posted for you in the chat, and you're welcome to go there and have a look. So again, welcome to this community of practice, where we try to bring together representatives from different regions, sectors, and stakeholder groups. And really the idea is to foster a mutually supporting consortium of stakeholders to discuss various issues related to chemicals. And today we're talking about a very important topic on risk communication. Many people often refer to, we need awareness raising. If people just knew the risks, they would behave differently, which is often a very big assumption. So it's a very important topic we will be discussing today in this community of practice. And we try to build the capacity of regulators, researchers, and NGOs in low and middle income countries, as well as discuss emerging issues. We hope to achieve this by learning from each other, sharing information and data, identifying gaps, problem solving, and really preventing chemical poisonings and environmental contamination with a view to a toxic-free future for the next generation. Just a reminder, or if you're new to this, this is not a webinar. We really try to simulate a discussion. So a lot of the discussion will be happening in the chat. Today, we will particularly be having a lot of poll questions, so do make sure you've clicked on the Menti link and you're familiar with it. And we do have a Q&A, so if you have a specific question you'd like to ask to one of the panelists today, please feel free to put that in the Q&A. It's a bit easier to find it than in the chat. So today's discussion is going to go slightly different than normal. We will have 3 presenters, but we won't be having a question after each presentation like we normally do. Instead, we will have, as I mentioned, quite a lot of polls. So we're hoping to really be able to discuss this issue of chemical risk communication and looking for sustainable approaches through the many poll questions. But as I said, you're more than welcome to ask any questions in the Q&A. Next slide, please. So there will be 3 of us taking you through this important topic of finding sustainable approaches to communicating chemical risks. We're more panelists, hopefully, today than presenters. So it'll be myself and Dr. Nosiku Munyinda from the University of Zambia, who is also a member of the joint meeting of pesticide management run by WHO and FAO. And we also are lucky to have Ellie Rogers from the University of Edinburgh, who is with the Center for Pesticide Suicide Prevention. And I would like to say welcome to my co-panelists and thank you for joining. Next slide, please. So while I'm going to talk to you a bit about risk communication, I'd like you to, we have a word cloud here. And if you can just take a minute, when you signed up for this topic, what did you think about? What went through your mind? What does risk communication represent to you? So if you click on the Menti link, you are able to put in a word or several words. And if you see a word that somebody else has put in, you're welcome to re-emphasize it by repeating it. So let's see if we can get a couple of words up. What does risk communication mean to you? Why is risk communication important? What does it stimulate? What kind of thought? And you can put in multiple words. Thank you. Okay, a lot on awareness. Responsibility, nice word, thank you. sharing information, educational. So this crossover between awareness on the impact, dialogue. That's a very important concept. And we will come back to that because often risk communication, and if you think of awareness raising, and I will raise this issue shortly, is this kind of linear top-down approach. So I really like that one of you is thinking about dialogue with risk communication. Okay, driving impact. Okay, so perhaps trying to get a change, protect the environment and human health. Dissemination of research findings, perhaps, evidence-based policy making. Nice, thank you. Okay, accountability, also very important, and we're going to talk about that as well. So you all have kind of different ideas that have come to mind about risk communication, and we'll go to the next slide. And what I want to do is just give you a brief kind of introduction from my side about risk communication. Then I'm going to hand over to Nosiku, who's going to give you some more ideas in relation to government's role and the things that governments do for communicating risks. And then we'll end up with Ellie providing the sort of research translation and communicating that. And actually, we won't end up there. We will go one more, where we will then end having a sort of a group discussion in terms of what kind of sustainable approaches, what kind of long-term repeated approaches can we find? Often when we talk about awareness raising, people do a once-off campaign and then assume that that will stimulate change. And of course, risk communication needs to be long-term sustainable. And you can see a few examples on the screen of communicating risks. So in South Africa and other low and middle income countries, we have these color codes on pesticides that communicate the toxicity of the active ingredient or the formulated product, with the assumption then that people will change their behavior in the way they will handle that chemical based on toxicity. And then also giving information in terms of what to do if you're poisoned, trying to encourage people not to drink milk or to give milk, and what number to phone if you need help. All of those kind of things need to be communicated. Next slide, please. So just to step back for a moment and to ground us in an understanding of risk communication, I think it's very important. This may be sort of old hat to many of you, but to think about the concept of hazard of a chemical versus the risk associated with it. So when we talk about the hazard, we're talking about the inherent toxicity. You can see the example on the right-hand side. So, you know, something that causes a harm, a shark can bite you, but it only becomes an issue when there's a risk. So when there's an exposure to that hazard. And it's very important to understand the difference between the two, because when we talk about hazard and risk communication, are we referring to the hazard, the inherent toxicity, or are we actually referring to the risk of being exposed to that? And in terms of assessing the hazard and the risk, we have the World Health Organization classification, as well as the globally harmonized system of the classification and labeling of chemicals, which Nosiku will talk about a bit more. And you can see some of the pictograms on the right-hand side under the hazard and risk pictures with the shark. And that takes us then to communication. So how we've identified that a chemical has a hazard, we've classified the hazard, whether it's acute hazard or chronic hazard, whether highly acute or has a low acute toxicity, is it carcinogenic, mutagenic, and how do we then communicate that to the general public or workers or policymakers? And so there are different ways. So often for the hazard, we use the safety data sheet, which should be available to all workers, labels, pesticide labels or chemical labels. We use pictograms. Often the assumption is that by using a pictogram, it's intuitively obvious and people with low literacy levels will be able to understand, which is not usually the case. And then when we're trying to explain what the risk is or communicate the risk, we use a broad range of mediums. So labels, posters, might have training, the media. In South Africa recently, we've had quite a lot going on with children who've been exposed to an organophosphate pesticide, turbofos, and who've been killed. And so there's been a lot in the media, and it's taken everyone in different directions. And every day there seems to be a different approach to what the risk has been. And also advertising is a form of risk communication. If you have adverts on television with chemicals that are showing exposures with children or animals, the assumption will be that perhaps the product is safe. Next slide. So having grounded in that, just to kind of bring us back to communication, how important communication is for raising awareness or for bringing issues to people's attention and for decision making. And I like this UNICEF quote where they say, communication is one of those human activities that everyone recognizes, but few can define satisfactorily. So how do you really efficiently communicate risks about chemicals and hazards? Next slide. What's important to understand with risk communication is what is the role, what is the purpose of it? And it's really, once we've defined that we understand what the impact will be or the potential that impact can have. And there are sort of four main roles of risk communication. So to inform and educate. So everyone keeps saying this, awareness raising, and we commonly use the label. As you can see the example on the right-hand side. We also use risk communication to change people's behaviors, to change their perceptions about something. And so, for example, the sign that says caution, wear your respirator, the assumption is that that information is going to trigger a behavior change. There's a lot of communication then during a crisis. So those first two are the more common ones. That's why I have the arrows next to them. And then there's this communicating during a crisis. We're all very familiar with COVID. And now looking at some of the impacts of flooding, for example, in Spain, there's been this reporting that there wasn't enough communication. And what are the kind of channels that people use to communicate in a crisis? And you can see the sign that says, warning that a pesticide has currently been applied and don't go through this until it's dry. And it also can be used for conflict resolution and problem solving. Next slide. So I mentioned this earlier that risk communication really developed many years ago in the 70s in the US. And the idea was that there was this recognition that the general public had a misconception of, particularly around chemicals. And so risk communication was used to alter perceptions. And this idea was that you had this scientific objective data, and if you could just present it to individuals, you would change their perception and then ultimately their behavior. And so that was this kind of linear one-way communication process, the sort of authoritarian top-down approach that people are ignorant, and if they just have information, never mind the fact how the information is presented or who presents it or in what format it's presented, all those things then came up later. And more recently, there's been this realization that we need to have this, what somebody said in the word cloud, the dialogue, the two-way communication, where you include community engagement in the discussion, and where the people who are being exposed are also having an opportunity to inform the decision making or inform what types of risk communication medium or media are being used. So it plays a really important role in chemical risk management and prevention. It can build trust if it's done well, and it can also facilitate decision making. And I dropped in, I don't know how well you can see it, but Fishoff in 1995 kind of came up with these developmental stages of risk management. And it's very telling that originally it was this, oh, we just have to do the numbers and present the numbers to people and they'll accept it and they'll change their behavior. And then much later on, it's we have to make them partners. Next slide, please. So I want to ask you a question now. Who do you think is responsible for communicating chemical health risks messages? So we've talked about the need for communicating, that the different ways to communicating, the roles, what different kind of roles. But who's responsible for doing this risk communication? And especially if you think of farmers or workers or the public. So you can just, if you want to respond to all three of those, you can just put a number in your answer. But then you can also, if you think that one group is responsible for everyone, you can put that in as well. So if you go, the link should be in the chat. So if you go to menti.com, you should be able to click on it. And okay, so government. And other thoughts? Okay, so we've got any stakeholder, government, industry, pesticide companies, regulators, schools, anyone selling the product. So I don't think it is a neat answer, but often there is an assumption. I like almost the comment about any stakeholders because it depends. It can depend, and you have to build trust within that community. But it's also important that it's quite, as someone said, unbiased, that people communicating about the health exposures and the risks don't necessarily have a mandate or a vested interest in selling the chemical or selling the product. But there is a role, obviously, for industry as well. So thank you. Thank you for all of those. Next slide, please. So we've talked about kind of what risk communication is and the different roles of risk communication. We've briefly touched on, who's actually responsible for doing it. And one thing I haven't really unpacked, but is important to keep in mind in terms of who's responsible is also who's going to fund it. Which is a very important question. We've spent a lot of time developing materials, particularly for low and middle income for low literate populations, and they're very expensive. And it's one thing just to develop, but then you also have to disseminate it. So now you've developed or want to develop some materials, and it's really important to understand that there isn't one vehicle, one medium that is appropriate for every situation and for every target audience. So it's really important then to look at who are you doing this for? And you can see the paper on the right-hand side. I actually did that now 10 years ago, where I was saying that the type of information, what you communicate, how you communicate differs for the decision makers versus the general public. So you really need to know what is their educational level. Do they have a visual literacy? So I highlighted these color codes. What happens if someone is colorblind and you've used a color code to communicate toxicity, for example? And so what we look at is, what is their reading level? What is the local conditions? Who's the messenger? Trust plays an incredibly important role in risk communication. And so is it someone within the community that's respected? Is it a particular newspaper or newspaper house that's respected? Is it a government official? And so again, who is actually transmitting that information? And what is the message? Sometimes we have these long, complicated messages that are being communicated, and we have no idea what the main point is. And then the medium. So predominantly we use labels for chemicals. We have a label on the chemical, whether it's a bottle of bleach or whether it's a pesticide, or whether it's a plastic bottle. It's either embossed in the container or we have a label. But in South Africa, for example, we don't have a culture of reading labels. It's not something that's taught at school. It's not something people grow up with. So is this an appropriate medium for communicating risks when people are not so familiar with them? Next slide. Right. So we're going to try another poll. And I wanted to ask you of these three pictures, which best illustrates the potential for a chronic health effect? So each one has slightly got obviously a different chronic effect that they're highlighting, but which one do you think is illustrating the best? All three of them are highlighting a chronic health effect. So Natasha, how are we doing it? Ah, there we are. Oh, well done. That's great. Thank you. So you can vote. Which picture best illustrates a chronic health effect? And I want you to think as you're voting, what's informing your decision? What are you basing your ideas on? What are you looking at? Okay, so we've got a race going between 1 and 2 at the moment. And really, the point is to illustrate that the vehicle that you use to communicate a risk, whether it's pictorial or whether it's something written or whether it's a training or whether it's through the media, will be appropriate for some of the target audience and may not necessarily speak to everyone. And so therefore, it's really important to think about having multiple types of mediums for communicating the same message. Not everyone will see it, hear it, or understand it in the same way. And that's the important point, is the aspect of comprehension. So it's one thing to communicate the message, but how are people actually understanding it and how is it being communicated? So the first one, for example, some of you are very familiar with. I mentioned in the beginning, we have a hazard classification system called the GHS, and they have 9 pictograms that are used for communicating the hazard of the chemical based on its classification. And this particular one is for chronic, but it would have a word underneath it. So it could be carcinogenic, mutagenic, it could have reproductive effects. The second one was from one of our projects where we were trying to indicate that there were potential reproductive impacts from workers applying pesticides but not wearing the correct PPE. And the third one I recently found was actually showing that by using these chemicals, it impacts on your brain. And it seems like only one person has found that appealing. So it's really been between the GHS and the other one that we've developed. But again, the point is to illustrate to you that different things will appeal to other people for different reasons. So thank you for your responses on that. Next slide, please. I just briefly want to indicate about risk perception. So how we perceive the risk. And one of the classic examples I like using is the idea of the seatbelt. You know, how many people actually won't put their seatbelt on if they only driving 5 minutes down the road because their perception is that risk of having an accident or being injured in those 5 minutes is low. However, there are other people who will put it on irrespective of how long they drive, because for them, they say, you know, once you're in the car, there's a risk. So it's our perceptions are shaped by information that we get, but they also impact how we understand the risk communication medium. And that's why I asked you as you were looking at the pictures, well, what did you think about? So what factors were influencing you? Did you know the GHS? Are you familiar with it? have you got research evidence that you knew about, prior experience? Maybe you had some reference knowledge based on it. So all those perceptions impact how you then understand and interpret the risk communication or what's being communicated. Next slide, please. So this is, I think, my last poll for my session. So what do you think should be the chemical industry's responsibility in communicating chemical risks and hazards to the end users? And while you're responding to that, I can see Poison Free the Peninsula has said, in my view, there are problems with all three. Whoops, sorry, my comments are jumping around. Let's see if I can get a hold of your comment. But it doesn't show a warning sign that something's badly is going on. What are the two images within the second image supposed to mean in association? So in the second image, it actually has a symbol for residue. So trying to teach the workers and low literate populations that there's potentially a residue that is associated with applying pesticides, and that you can breathe that in or can penetrate through your skin if you don't have a respirator on or the right protective equipment. And some of the chemicals are then have reproductive toxicity. Very complicated concept, trying to illustrate it in very simple, no language terminology. Not easy at all. Okay, so what are some of the responsibilities of industry? List all the potential hazards in local languages. So one of the things would be having QR codes on pesticide labels, perhaps using the QR codes. There's always someone in communities that have a smartphone and having it in different languages. The complexity is if people can't read. Transparency, so chemicals used and their hazards and perhaps the quantity, clearly and accessible information. Sorry, can you scroll back up? I've missed. Monitor the effectiveness of the communication. So now this is bringing up the point of sustainability and needing to repeat things. They must inform people about the side effects, labeling, disclose physical health, transparency. You can scroll down. Thank you. And clear and well labeled. So I think it's important to think about what the industry's responsibility is. And going back to that question of, who's responsible for communicating? And I think there is also a role for industry to fund a lot of risk communication that's being done by government, for example, but not necessarily having to always do the communication. They are required to do the labels, and what needs to be on the label is then standardized. And that's what's important, is we need to have also standardized principles for communicating risks, and that there isn't a liability attached if it isn't standardized. So in other words, pesticide labels are a legally binding document. But if, for example, a domestic product doesn't have wear your gloves on it, then how can you be held liable for an exposure or an acute effect that you've had because you weren't aware that you needed to wear gloves, for example? All right, thank you very much. That was lots of good comments. Next slide, please. So to round up, it's important, there's so many components to risk communication. And one of the things to keep in mind is that it can be done poorly. And so you can give the wrong information or not have this two-way process where you're then finding out how people actually understand what is being communicated. So it could build a lack of trust. It could create this sort of information overload, which is ineffective. People switch off. And that's what happens with signage. if you go into a workplace, there's so much signage about chemicals that people don't see them anymore. They have this familiarity with them. It can help get in a situation where it avoids accountability by industry. It can fail to inform about the hazards and the risks adequately, may only refer to a few things and not actually give enough information. It allows for misinterpretation, like these pictograms. If you're using just the pictograms for indicating what the hazard is, people may understand them incorrectly and end up having more exposure based on the misinterpretation. Also could foster misuse. Sorry, not misuse, overuse. We have the situation when people think the red color code, which is the most toxic pesticides, organophosphates, for example, people tend to think that those are the better and the stronger ones, and so you should use those. So that becomes then a misinterpretation. It could also lead to poor disposal and reuse of containers. Next slide. So that takes me through my introduction to you on risk communication. And if you have any questions for me, I hope you'll post them in the Q&A. I'll have a look at them and respond to them. But in the meantime, I'm now going to hand over to Nosiku, who is going to take you through the role of the government in communicating chemical risks. And Nosiku, thanks again for taking your time to join us. And you're welcome to turn on your video if you have the bandwidth. So over to you.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you. Thanks, Prof. And good afternoon, everyone. I've turned on my camera just for a bit so I can just wave and say good afternoon and hi to everyone from the different places where you're joining us from. It's a pleasure to be here once again. So my role today is to talk about how government is involved in communicating chemical risks. It's good that Prof set the platform for us in talking about hazards and risks. So, and I've seen that we've got quite a number of government representatives here from the different sectors of government. And again, it's good to have such a wide range of sectors represented. Next slide, Natasha. Okay, so very quickly, as we talk about risks and hazards, we need to think about the scope of the hazards that we're looking at. So we could be looking at health hazards, it could be physical hazards, it could be environmental hazards, and of course the risks that are associated with these hazards that we're looking at. Next slide. So when we start talking about chemicals, again, just to bring us back to what we are looking at. So the chemicals go through a life cycle. So in this case, we're looking at risk communication from the point of inception of the chemical. So literally from the cradle to the disposal of the chemicals. All these stages of the chemical life cycle, government has a role to communicate risks to the various target audiences. So again, just sort of setting the scope for what we'll be discussing. Next slide. So who is the government? We always use this term very, very loosely. Who's the government? In literal sense, the definition of government is, the political system that's in charge of handling the affairs of a country, of a state, or whatever geographical jurisdiction. So in this case, we're looking at the political system that has the responsibility to manage issues to do with chemicals management. And again, if we think about our chemical life cycle, at the various stages, you may have different government institutions that are responsible for chemical management at that stage. So here I've just put a number of examples. So we have the Ministry of Health that are mostly looking at surveillance for poisoning, issues of food safety, food contamination, toxicological analysis, issues to do with sale and management of medicines and allied substances, public health chemicals or pesticides used in the control of public health pests, occupational health surveillance, and the management of chemicals related to the healthcare environment. So within the the health systems, there are quite a number of chemicals that are used there. So these would all fall under. Next slide. And then we also have ministries to do with trade and industry. Prof talked about standardization and certification. So those kind of functions would fall under these ministries of commerce, trade and industry. So both in-country regulations, as well as coordinating bilateral, multilateral trade agreements, which include issues of chemicals. So I'll give an example from within the SADC region. We have COMESA, for example, the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa. And in this case, the Ministry of Commerce and Trade would have a role to play when it comes to the trade or importation, exportation of chemicals to do with in the agriculture sector or personal care chemicals. Let's think about skin lightening creams and so on. So this ministry, while not seeming to be a main ministry in chemicals management, does have a very key role to play in communicating risks as well. Then we have the ministries responsible for labor. And again, like the name states, these usually look at occupational safety in terms of safe handling of chemicals in the workplace, and also in the implementation of the ILO conventions on safe use of chemicals in the workplace. Next. Our Ministry of Agriculture. I know that most of our participants, we have quite a number from agriculture. This ministry is responsible for chemicals, of course, on the farms in use in agriculture. And there are various, throughout the life cycle, Ministry of Agriculture is involved in communicating risks, or should be communicating risks. Ministry of Mines, Minerals Development, again, you have quite a number of chemicals that are used in the mines, but are also emissions from the mines. So then that ministry would be responsible for taking care of chemical issues there. Environmental protection have the coordinating role in terms of enforcing environmental legislation. Okay, so this is all within government. This is all within government. Our next slide. The Ministry of Local Government is increasingly getting more prominence when it comes to issues of chemical safety. We've seen that traditionally, Ministry of Local Government has been more involved in public health and food safety, but more and more we are seeing the Ministry of Local Government getting involved in safe use or chemicals within the home, within the buildings. So issues of asbestos and other lead in paints and so on. So we're seeing an increasing role that Ministry of Local Government is taking on. And of course, issues to do with disposal of those chemicals would traditionally fall under this ministry. Ministry of Education, Research, Laboratory Capacity, research in academic institutions and so on, all these fall under Ministry of Education. And then the Ministry of Finance. Prof talked about who's going to fund this, resource mobilization for government. This is very critical in terms of domestic revenue, as well as international agreements or international funding mechanisms. So this would traditionally come under the Ministry of Finance. So that broadly is who is this government when we're looking at how should government be involved in risk communication. And again, let's not forget our chemical life cycle. Next slide. So who are the target audiences for the government? Primarily, who is government trying to communicate to? So again, if we think about the different sectors we've looked at and we think about our chemical life cycle, we realize that a lot of government's role is in regulation. So it's within the regulations that they'll give advice to other regulators. They'll give advice to workers in the occupational setting. They'll give advice to traders in industry. They'll give advice to consumers, and of course to researchers as well. You can add to this list of who are the target audiences of government. It depends on which part of the pesticide or the chemical life cycle the government agency is dealing with. Next slide. Okay. So we can move to the next one, Natasha. So let's talk about ourselves as the people on this call, on this panel discussion. What are your expectations, or what are our expectations of government's role? The first question that Prof raised in the poll was, who is responsible for risk communication? And quite a number of us said government. Government kept coming up. So what do we expect government, what's their role in communicating risk? What is government's role in communicating risk, and what are the best ways that government can do it to communicate risk to the varied audiences that we discussed in the previous slide? So if we can just quickly answer. And what are the best ways? Okay.
You're breaking up a bit, Nosiku, but I think we got the point. And just a reminder that the link is in the chat.
So we still have the link in the chat. What expectations do we have from government? Okay. So the regulations, we need them to communicate on the regulations that are in place. Regulations that are clear and not ambiguous. Okay. Not sure what that means. Government should enforce regulations in the country. Clearly enforce safe handling of the chemicals. Okay. I don't know how that is communicating the risks. Give explanation on local radio. Okay, so that's one of the ways that government could be communicating on local radios. Okay, let's keep it going. Coordinate risk communication designs. Okay, that's a good one. So the different risk communications from the various designers, government could coordinate this. Okay. Legislative requirements, absolutely. Okay, regulate chemical risk communication. That's an interesting one, that government should actually regulate the communication of risks. Okay, it's a new one. Designate a public entity that's responsible for communication. Not sure whether that's really possible to have one public entity, okay, that will communicate the risks. Putting in place legislation with standardized symbols, okay? A number of countries do have these standardized symbols, even within low and middle income countries. Reestablish extension services, that's probably in agriculture, to support farmers. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. We have a wide range of expectations from government. I'm sure our government officials can see quite a number of expectations from government and the different ways that they can do this. So establishing the laws, ensuring awareness and training for public health officers, awareness.
Sorry, Nosiku, we've lost you.
My apologies, Prof.
You might have to repeat yourself. We didn't hear what you said.
Okay, so I was talking about comprehensibility testing, that a number of communication messages, but there has to be comprehensibility testing to see how the various stakeholder groups or target audiences are actually comprehending the messages. Okay, we can move to the next slide, Natasha. Thank you for the responses. So how does government communicate risks? So like Prof was saying, a lot of times government would do this as they are regulating the issues of chemicals. So the first point of regulation will be in the safety data sheets. Okay, we can have the next slide, Natasha.
Hi, Nosiku, this is the next slide. It's the second poll.
Oh, okay.
Nosiku, do you want us to come back to the slide?
Yes, I think so. We can move to the next one on safety data sheets. Yeah, thank you, Prof. Yeah, so when we come to safety data sheets, I think Prof set the stage very well. That safety data sheets are the first point of contact that a lot of governments will have with the chemical. So the idea behind the safety data sheets is that it contains a lot of valuable information about the chemical. So they'll have the chemical name, it will have labeling elements, the various labeling elements. It will talk about the physiochemical data, human health, environmental toxicology, first aid advice, storage, management, and handling of the chemical, and so on. So these safety data sheets are extremely important in communicating different risks or hazards that are inherent within that chemical that's coming into the country. So before any chemical comes into the country or is used in the country, the governments will require this safety data sheet. Next point, Natasha. Next slide. So that's the first way that governments communicate chemical risks, is through the safety data sheets, and that just shows the different elements within this data sheets. And the function of the data sheets. Our next slide. The functions of the data sheets are mostly to communicate the hazard. So in this case, what it's looking at is the hazard. If we're looking at the physiochemical components of a chemical, the flammability, how oxidizing the chemical is, that would be more to do with the inherent hazard of the chemical. When it comes to risk, the data sheets will give advice on safe handling. So in this case, they are trying to give advice to reduce exposure to the hazard that's inherent in that chemical. So the data sheet will talk about remedial action. What happens if you have a spillage? What happens if it falls on your arm? What happens if it goes into a water body? So the data sheet will give you the remedial actions there. It will give you the legal requirements of that chemical depending on the country that you're looking at. So the data sheet communicates responsible care. I remember in the word cloud, we had somebody who talked about responsibility as one of the functions for risk communication. So the data sheets actually brings in the element of responsible care. Okay, next. So these data sheets usually work in the context of workplaces. They work in the context of emergency personnel. So if there's an accident, what do I do to handle the accident? It works for people who are handling and working with chemicals so that they handle them safely. Now that leaves us with the question of how about the other stages of that life cycle of the chemical? Next slide, Natasha. How are risks communicated to when it comes to more consumer kind of chemicals? Pharmaceuticals, food additives, cosmetics, pesticide residues in food. These are usually not covered in safety data sheets. So then what will cover the communication for this aspect or this stage of the chemical life cycle? How does government communicate that risk? And that brings us to the next poll question, which was the one that was looking at the elements. So how can government now communicate to the consumers? That's a question that you guys should think about. For food additives, for pharmaceuticals, for cosmetics, pesticide residues, what elements should government then bring in to communicate these risks to consumers at the point of handling, at the point of use? Okay, there should be a poll question. It's in the chat. How can government communicate the risks, or what other elements should be included in government chemical risk communication to consumers, especially to consumers? Okay, I've seen that, Natasha. So let's answer the polls. What are the best ways that government could communicate? What elements? And in this case, we're focusing on consumer chemicals, the ones that we use at home, the ones that are in food additives, the ones that are in pharmaceuticals, pesticide residues in food that are not covered usually traditionally in a safety data sheet. How can government communicate this information?
Sorry, Nosiku. Okay.
Okay. Provide information, how to understand the label, pictograms, color codes. Okay. So more, again, comprehensibility testing to build the knowledge on how to understand and interpret the information on labels. Okay, hazards posed by the chemicals, safe handling of these products. Okay. The adverts addressing the dangers. Okay. Through adverts addressing dangers of hazardous chemicals to human health. Community engagement. Okay, this is a good one. Community engagement. We've been talking about dialogue. So a lot of times we have this very formal approach from government on chemical risk communication. But now increasingly, it looks like this issue of community engagement and dialogue keeps coming up. Okay. Literacy levels of target audiences. Okay, so probably to target different messages to different literacy levels. Okay, this will help. All right, thank you. We can move to the next slide, Natasha. On the label elements. Okay, thank you, Philip. I've seen your contribution in the chat about engaging the public again. So more public engagement. Okay. Natasha, we can move to the next slide on label elements. Okay. Workshops, school curricula, trainings, different media can be used to communicate these messages, definitely. The different media can be used by government to communicate these messages. Okay, road shows, outreach programs, pictograms again, and labels. Okay. All right, Natasha, we can move to the next slide. Social media. I was waiting for social media. Social media is one of the biggest platforms that we have that people are exposed to nowadays. And somebody was talking about credible information and regulating risk communication. So that's an aspect that probably a lot more discussion can be had. How can government ensure that social media risk communication messages are actually credible, that they're actually authentic? Of course, the ones that originate from government are credible because they're coming from government. But how about the other risk communication messages? That's another discussion that hopefully we'll have at some point. Okay, we can move, Natasha. Okay, so just spending a bit of time on label elements, because this is something that is legislated. It's something that every chemical should have, and government has a role of looking at the different labels. So Prof started talking about labels earlier on, and a lot of our governments are now using GHS labels, and these labels have basic elements that should be on each chemical label, as long as it's under GHS. So the core elements, you always have a symbol, and this appears on the GHS label as a pictogram. So you have a pictogram on every label. You have a signal word, which is the word that indicates the relative level of severity of the hazard. So in this case, you could have danger. The GHS uses danger and warning. And then you have the precautionary statement, and this describes the recommended measures that should be taken to minimize or prevent unfavorable effects. So you see that on the GHS labels, you have the hazard is communicated, but you also have measures to reduce the risk. So in this case, the risk communication message that's in the label is more about what you need to do in case this happens, or how you need to prevent the exposure from occurring. So the next few slides are just giving just a small snapshot of what these different elements are. I won't go into a lot of detail, but just for those who have not been exposed to this, these are the various elements of these GHS labels that should be on every chemical that is being sold. So Natasha, we can just quickly go through the next series of slides. So we have the pictograms. As we can see there, you have pictograms to do with storage, for safekeeping, You have pictograms on advice, wear gloves, wear the face shields. You have wash after use. You have warnings within the pictograms. This is dangerous to animals, dangerous to fish. And again, issues of comprehensibility comes in because these are pictures. So people need to be able to interpret what these pictures mean. And that's where the issues of education come in. And then we come to symbols. Next slide. So within the labels, you have these symbols. We talked about, Prof started talking about these symbols earlier on. So you have symbols that are related to health hazards. You have symbols that are related to environmental hazards. And then you have symbols that are related to physical hazards. Depending on where you're working, depending on the chemicals, these symbols would differ. The most important thing is that people should be able to interpret the symbol. For example, the skull and crossbones. This one is a symbol that usually, in my country, for example, this is associated with electricity, that there's going to be a power outage or something, because that's where you usually find it. The symbol for toxicity that Prof shared earlier on, does everybody understand what this symbol stands for? The exclamation mark, would everybody understand what that means? So these symbols are part of the legal requirements for the labeling of chemicals, but again, the issue of comprehensibility come in. Next, we look at signal words. So within the signal words, again, if you see, next slide, Natasha. If somebody just finds a chemical and the chemical has a danger signal word there, what does that mean? So in this case, signal words would be communicating more severe hazards. Warning would be less severe hazards. And only one word is used on a label to avoid confusion. I think earlier on, somebody talked about ambiguous risk communication messages. Risk communication has to be as clear as possible. So government's role is to ensure that these symbols or the signal words are not ambiguous and they actually communicate what they're supposed to communicate. So when somebody sees warning, they will understand what warning stands for. Next slide. Okay, so hazard statements. Again, hazard statements, just like the name says, these categorize the risks into the various hazards. So some will be highly flammable, others are toxic in contact with skin, very toxic, and so on. So you have hazard statements that are on the labels as well. Next slide is on precautionary statements. So again, this is a phrase that describes what you need to do in case of an accident, in case of a spillage. We can move to the next slide. And within the precautionary statements, you have those that are general, you have those that are response precautionary statements, you have those that have to do with storage, and you have those that are sort of guidelines on disposal. So all these elements are contained within this label. So imagine if everybody, all the consumers understood what these labels are actually trying to communicate. That would really, really go a long way in reducing risk, especially for consumer chemicals. Next slide. So that's just an example. The next slide is an example of a label. As you can see, this label has all the various elements of GHS within it. So you have your signal words, you have the identity of the chemical, you have your pictograms, you have your precautionary statements, you have your hazard statements, and so on. So from the government side, if these labels are properly affixed to a container and people can read them, then they should communicate risk. But of course, the question arises, they're usually in English. Does everybody understand English? Some of them are stuck on bottles and they fall off. And so how then does the government, in addition to the labels, in addition to the SDS, how then does government communicate these risks? And that's our next slide. I think we had the poll question and you came up with very good suggestions. So chemical registers, governments do register chemicals, and one of you actually talked about this in the polls. So within the chemical registers, some governments embed their hazard information. So you could have interactive chemical registers where you click on a certain chemical name and the hazard information comes up. So again, that presupposes that you have access to the internet and so on, but this would be a very good tool or a very good way that government could communicate risks. Electronic media, so you talked about radio, TV, social media, all these are platforms that government also uses to communicate risks. Print media, you have the posters, you have your brochures, and so on. I put brochures twice there, I'm sorry. So you have print media as well. And again, issues of comprehensibility comes in, issues of literacy levels come in, and usually these are the ways that government does supplement risk communication. Marketing. So marketing platforms, a lot of government institutions will take part in exhibitions. So they'll have stands there and they'll explain what the mandates are. Somebody was talking about the different legislative requirements. So usually government will use such fora to talk about the legislative mandates that they have, and in that way also hopefully communicate risks. Commercial shows, increasingly we've seen that governments are using drama, for example, or they could use a well-known influencer. We have influencers nowadays. So they can use influencers and so on to try and capture different target audiences and communicate risks to those different target audiences. So we come to our very last poll question. We've been talking about governments, industry, and so on. And earlier on, Prof did raise this. This is a one-way communication. So this is government communicating risks to different stakeholders, different target groups. How do we as the public communicate risks back to the government? If I use a certain product and I find that this product has caused me an adverse reaction or has resulted in something in my crops, I've found that this is not working. How do you think the public should be able to communicate to government officials about chemical risks? How can we make this a two-way process so that it's not just one directional, but it's actually back and forth? How do the public, what do you think the public can do? How can they communicate these risks back to the government in terms of the use, in terms of the handling of the various chemical risks? Okay. Okay. Kenya has a toll-free line for alerting government to non-compliance, exposures, and so on. So we do have this toll-free line in Kenya. I'm not sure if South Africa has one. I don't know if the Zambian one is up and running. There was talk about having a toll-free line as well. Website or online portals, very good. SMS, government social media handles. Okay, whenever they come across, okay, whistleblowing to government on manufacturers, that's an interesting one. Of course, you need to have that whistleblowing policy, but definitely. So if there's something that somebody notices with the manufacturers, then there should be open lines for easy reporting. Toll-free lines, okay, government chemicals risk helpline, social media. I've seen social media come up more than once, and it looks like a lot of people are now going to social media and in that way trying to force government to act. Extension services, media and research groups, very interesting. I was wondering where academia would come in. Environmental organizations, we have quite a number of NGOs on this platform. So yes, environmental and organizations. Prof has posed the question on the role of poison information centers as well, as we're talking about reporting back to government. Traditional leaders, local leaders, this is a good one. Yeah, so reporting through local leaders. And that's the assumption there is that the government has coordination mechanisms with those local leaders. Yeah, community representatives, very, very good. Very, very good suggestions coming up here. So forums, for different fora, town halls. So this again puts the onus on government to organize these different dialogue platforms where people can speak and give feedback from the people, give experiences from the people, and foster this open communication. Lead farmers, farmer groups, policy briefs, social media through NGOs, poison information centers. Yeah. So there are various, we can see that there are various platforms that the public can communicate. I'll leave you with this question, but do we actually use these platforms? If I was to say by a show of hands, how many of us have actually used any of these platforms to communicate chemical risks? You eat something today and you notice you have a reaction. what's the first thing that you do? How many of us have written to the government? How many of us have spoken to our local leaders? How many of us have gone to social media? So again, all these platforms are existing platforms. So perhaps the question is, are we utilizing these platforms? How well are we actually utilizing these platforms to communicate back to government so government can continue doing its job in regulating these chemicals? So that was our last question through our monitoring teams. Very good suggestions coming up. So we can see that government has a very big role to play in communicating risks. And so far, I think by and large, it's being done traditionally using the traditional media. And if you have a project, you may have different projects doing awareness raising. And we'll have the last bit where we'll talk about sustainable risk communication. I'll end here. Thank you for your time. And we'll discuss on the sustainability aspect before we close. Thank you. Back to you, Prof.
Thanks very much, Nosiku, and for all the information and engaging the discussion so well on a very important topic. So we've kind of heard from a government perspective, we heard from me from an academic perspective, and now we're going to move to Ellie, who's coming to us from more of a communications perspective and not necessarily an academic on chemicals. So Ellie, thank you very much for giving of your time, and we look forward to hearing from you. Over to you.
Thank you. So just to say up front, as Andrea said before, I'm from the Centre for Pesticide Suicide Prevention, which is at the University of Edinburgh, and the communications officer there. Just a bit of a warning, and that means I will be talking a little bit about suicide and self-harm. So if you find that distressing or upsetting at all, I will not be offended if you decide to mute me at any points in time. So if we can just move to the next slide. Thank you. Yes, so I'm going to be talking about how we translate academic research. So for those of you who aren't aware, the Centre for Pesticide Suicide Prevention is a research and policy initiative at the university. Our work is very much focused on pesticide and pesticide self-poisoning or suicides. And we work globally to try and prevent these deaths by bringing in bans and restrictions on the dangerous pesticides. It's very much rooted in academic research. And just as an example, I've got up here just a handful of some of our papers or papers that we've been involved in with other colleagues that have come out over the last few years in terms of showing what the key risks are. And what I would say is some of our core messages that we or I as a communicator are trying to put across that come from this evidence is one, that pesticide self-poisoning is a huge global health problem. Two, that this is caused by access to highly hazardous pesticides, acutely toxic pesticides. That is the main cause of these preventable deaths. Three, that the most effective way to prevent these deaths is to ban the dangerous pesticides. And sort of four, that we know that this can be done effectively without any adverse impact on agriculture as well, that, you know, where this has been done right, we haven't seen issues with them sort of in terms of food yield and productivity. So that's just, you know, a bit of background. So I'm going to move on now to I think the first poll. Move on. So this is just to ask you all, just a selection of, when it comes to academic research, how do you get your information? Is it through the journal articles themselves? Do you sit and read new papers that come out? Or do you rely on getting that information given to you through other sources, whether it's news pieces to the media, social media, policy briefs, attending events? How do you find out about the latest research on pesticides or chemical risks that's coming out? Oh, interesting. The whole mix here between different things. I'm quite impressed how many of you sit and read full journal articles. Social media is coming through strongly as well. newspapers, opinion pieces, less so, newsletters, policy briefs. Yeah, so there's a real mix coming through. And I guess this again comes from where, you know, what your background is. If you are based in academia, then I can understand, you know, in terms of you may be more used to accessing journal articles as well. If, you know, that's not something you are used to, then maybe it's different sources. But okay, that's been really interesting, actually. I think there's been a few more for journal articles than I necessarily thought, but really good to see. If we can then, oh, there's still some more coming in. I'm now going to move on just to talk about some of the work that I do and use some of these examples that we've just spoken about my work as a communicator, how I try and get our research out there. So first of all, I'm going to talk about sort of news articles. And I've just got an example up here. On the left-hand side is a quick screenshot of a journal article that came out. This was led by one of our collaborators in Malaysia a couple of years ago. It was a new study that looked at the impact of a paraquat ban. And on the left-hand side here is as I say, is the article itself. Quite a long title there, surveillance of pesticide poisoning in East and West Malaysian hospital, characteristics of pesticide poisoning and the early impact of a national paraquat ban. And then the article itself goes into detail about the study, how it was conducted. It's quite a long article, really great article. But what I've tried to do then on the right-hand side there is read through that and try and pick up what is the key information we're trying to communicate. What are the key messages that are coming out of that, and put that out in a different form for people who maybe don't have the time or energy to read and understand the paper in that form. So on the right-hand side, you see I've gone for the title, Malaysia's deadly pesticide ban has helped prevent deaths, new study suggests, because that was really the key finding from this. What the study showed is that the ban is having a really positive impact. It's just early analysis, but it's showing that it's having a positive impact on preventing deaths. And then my article goes on to give those key findings up front, explain a bit about the context, what the study did in summary, and why this is important. So really try and pull out of those key messages in a more accessible way, that if someone who wasn't an academic could quickly read my article in 2 minutes and understand what those key findings are. And just move on slightly. Slide. So that's one way I look to communicate our research. When we've got those new papers, I'm always saying to people, send me your papers so I can look at them and put an article together ready. But also that's just at that moment of time when it's published. And I also use blogs and opinion pieces throughout the year to think of other opportunities of getting our work up there and sharing the messages in maybe a more of an interesting way. News articles can sometimes be a bit dry, but can we make it a bit more interesting? So here's a couple of more of the opinion pieces, the blogs we have out here. So on the left-hand side, how pesticide poisoning became a global health problem. This was an article I put together for this year for Global Health Day, World Health Day this year. And what I felt was missing, although we had lots of information in different places, there was different papers that showed different things, I felt we were missing an article that pulled all that different evidence into one place and gave a really nice summary of what the problem was, where it came from, what's been happening about it. And, you know, based on all that evidence that's been collected over the years, from, you know, pesticides becoming on the scene, the green revolution, the dangers of particular pesticides and the easy access to acutely toxic pesticides, difficulties in regulation, and really brought that together. The other thing I did when I put this article together is I thought very carefully about keywords and Google and algorithms and what were the keywords that might come up. And this has actually become one of the most read articles on our website, in terms of, you know, all this information already existed on our website by different places, and this really sort of pulled it together. On the right-hand side is a different kind of article we put out. This is an article, a blog written by our wonderful filmmaker. We're very fortunate to have a filmmaker, and I'll talk a little bit about her work in a minute, and why she started making films about pesticide suicide. Because what I've found is stats can be sometimes quite dry, and what people can relate to is stories about people. And this here is a wonderful article of Hishani, 20 odd years ago, living in Sri Lanka and seeing there was a problem and wanting to start making a film about it. She started interacting with researchers. She started finding out what the problem was. And then she ended up creating her first documentary. So it's still bringing out the research and the context, but it's her story of discovering that research and wanting to tell the story and putting it out there, and then why she thinks it's so important. If we can move on to the next slide, please. Oh, there we go. It's just another example of a blog. This one, again, this was us reacting to a situation. So we're quite often trying to engage with policymakers to show the importance of needing bans, the issues in a particular country, why bans work, what we should be thinking about. And one of the examples we always use is Sri Lanka, because Sri Lanka had great success years ago bringing in some really careful bans targeted at specific hazardous pesticides that were causing death, and they saw a massive drop in their suicide rate. However, a couple of years ago, when there was the economic crisis in Sri Lanka had also just brought in a very, very sudden ban on all pesticides and fertilizers. And we were finding when we were having, our team, when we were having these discussions, we were getting pushback from people saying, no, but the bans in Sri Lanka didn't work because look, they've led to economic crisis. And what we felt there was a need for was something that explained it, again, took the research and explained the difference. These are very different bans. One was a set of very carefully considered bans, very targeted bans on pesticides. And the other was a complete sudden total ban. And we felt that we needed something out there that explained the difference. So this was a blog we put out that essentially explained the difference between the two bans. And it set out really why we shouldn't be letting the current crisis overshadow the success. What Sri Lanka did in the past, its successful bans, shouldn't be forgotten. They should still be used as an example because they are different. So if we can move on, please. The next slide. There we go. So that moves me on nicely to talking about video. So I mentioned a filmmaker before, but also I mentioned about Sri Lanka there. And so, as I say, we're fortunate to have a filmmaker. We very much use visual storytelling as a way of getting our messages out because we know that different people engage with different mediums. So here are just a couple of examples. The one on the left is essentially a 5-minute animation that does exactly the same as that blog I just mentioned about. Talks about Sri Lanka's bans and talks about the difference between them. Because that was so key for us, we look to create this in terms of really trying to get that message out in different ways. On the right-hand side there is just an example of a documentary we put out last year, which was all based on Nepal and Nepal's Nepal's journey to bring in bans on particular pesticides. And this, as I say, this was about a 25-minute documentary. And I should say as well, this is also a good example of dialogue, that two-way dialogue that was mentioned previously. Because when we create these films, when our filmmaker creates our documentaries, she doesn't just go out and stick a camera in front of people's faces. It's a very thought out process. First of all, there's always a pre-production trip where she goes and she engages with communities. She talks to researchers, she talks to community members, she talks to policymakers. She really gets to grips with the understanding of the issue and gives them a chance to contribute to the documentaries we create. And then she goes back and does the filming. And we find this very successful because it's a way of engaging. People want to get engaged in creating the documentary, and it brings through different voices. So it's not just researchers sitting on camera talking about what the research says. It's brought to life by talking to people who, families of poison patients, talking to researchers, community members who are based locally in countries as well, people working in agriculture, doctors. And again, this particular film, which came out last year, earlier this year, I know it was shown at a big international symposium held in Kathmandu, which was attended by lots of policymakers, and I believe has helped contribute to further discussions around the need to introduce further bans on pesticides in Nepal that haven't already been banned. There's many other films as well that we've done. Please have a look at our YouTube channel if you're interested as well. If we could just move on. Next slide. Yes, so sticking with this idea of visuals, which I think are very important. I've talked a little bit about news articles and blogs, but I really think visuals are important because they tell a story in a way that other things sometimes can't do. And so I've got a couple of examples here again of graphics and graphs that I have used in the past to try and get those messages out there. The one on the left is tells that story of Sri Lanka that I mentioned, Sri Lanka's real success. And I think nothing quite shows it that like this graph, because you can see here that the suicide rate for many years is staying stable, going up a little bit. The green revolution hits, there becomes wide availability of toxic pesticides that are unregulated, and you will see it shoots up to a really high level. And then you've got those red arrows showing the pesticide bans. These are the well thought out, carefully implemented pesticide bans. And you see that the number of deaths reduce significantly and quite rapidly. So the deaths fall by 70%. And just to make the point as well, this is the overall suicide rate. This isn't the pesticide suicide rate. This is the overall suicide rate, which is sort of backing up our message of how effective it is. You know, people are not going, we're not seeing replacement of people intent on killing themselves who then use a different method. This means restriction approach really works in saving lives. The graph on the right-hand side is one I put together specifically for social media. I think this was Twitter, although we actually don't use Twitter anymore because it's no longer sort of working for us as a platform. But yeah, the one on the right is looking at agriculture. So again, one of the key pushbacks we get is, oh, but if you're banning the pesticides are needed for agriculture, and you'll see crop yields go down. And again, nothing quite shows it than a graph. So this was some data that was coming out of Nepal a couple of years ago. We quickly put it into this graph. You see the dots at the top that show the time frames of the pesticide bans. And then you've got the yield of pulses, rice and vegetables. And we're not seeing that huge drop. And I think this is quite visually impactful, showing that and sort of communicating that data that we have. Can we move on, please? Yeah, and just the final example I wanted to give here was around social media. So social media has been mentioned quite a lot recently. Of course, we use social media as well, because it's one thing to post an article on our site on places, but yes, you can try and optimize it with algorithms for Google, but you also need to do that promotion of sharing. So LinkedIn is our key channel now for social media. And that's where, we are also on a few other channels, but I would say it's our most effective channel for reaching key audiences. And I've just put here a couple of the posts that we've put out, and again, trying to use those visuals. So on the left here was a recent blog that was out on Suicide Prevention Day, looking at all the data and evidence behind means restriction and why it works, which includes pesticides, but also included some sort of wider means as well. And so, in addition to posting the link, I've tried to put a little graphic that hopefully captures attention together with the title that grabs people's attention. And on the right hand side there, this was just a couple of weeks ago. It was World Statistics Day. I try to keep an eye on these key international days when it's kind of good to grab attention. And so I just used an opportunity to put a very, very quick graphic together that just had a key stat around global suicides. And then I used that as an opportunity to include some of those key stats that have come from the research around suicide and pesticide suicide as well. So I am going to that's the end of those examples there. So yes, thank you, the poll. Yes, and then I'm going to change tack slightly to talk about safe messaging. I think, Natasha, you might have split this into two polls, but if I can, I think we can combine these two polls into one, and I'll try and explain it. So this question is for you, thinking about safe messaging and thinking of particularly sensitive content when it comes to things like pesticide suicide, but also pesticide risks. Is there anything we should or shouldn't include when we're communicating pesticide risks? Is there anything we should be aware of? And I'm thinking particularly around safe messaging. How can we ensure we do this safely? Where is the balance between awareness raising and making sure that our messaging is safe?
Sorry, Ellie, the whole thing won't fit into one poll question, unfortunately.
No, that's fine. I think the two were the same, in terms of people's comments, it's really the same question. So I'll just keep it open-ended here. So it's just what you should or shouldn't do when communicating pesticide risks, and any examples of things you can think of in terms of those safe messaging. And I'll go through quickly some of the things that we do from our guidelines. How do we make sure we're not making the risks greater and putting people at more risk? Not mention the name of the product in the media. Yep. Sensationalize, absolutely. Diversity, cultural diversity, yep. Got any more? Clear information. Helplines, false advertising, really interesting. Lethalness of particular brands. So that's interesting because somebody's talked about not naming the product and someone else has talked about bringing up the brands. I know we're starting to run out of time, so if anyone's got anything else to add, maybe do it quickly. So I've just got 2 very last quick slides to include. Say what people can do and not always what they shouldn't do. Some manufacturers can use social media to discredit their competition. That's true. One message. Okay. I think just for the sake of time, maybe we'll move on quickly. This is as it's covered. So I'm just going to cover quickly. Now this is very much tailored around pesticide suicide, but I think there's some things that's wider. And this is very much focused on safe messaging. I'm just going to quickly give some examples from our guidelines that we put together, working with sort of experts on suicide prevention, on communicating safely. And I know there was some other sort of good things that came out in the chat there. So some of this is very much a general for suicide. So the do's are very much about general for suicide, about think about what language you use, include trigger warnings, in terms of people going to find harmful, include links to helplines, which somebody mentioned in the slide there. The don'ts here, I think there's some more particular things related to pesticides. And I put a little red arrow against the ones that I'm going to pull out in particular. The first is the use of graphic imagery. Don't use graphic imagery of a poisoned patient who is dying, because that can be really triggering for people. Or show depictions, whether it's just an animation or a reconstruction of someone ingesting pesticide, or explicitly describe how somebody can poison themselves. And then the next one, jumping down to the next arrow, is linked to that. We really should not be giving quantities, saying X amount will kill you. Because again, if somebody's feeling vulnerable, that's essentially giving them an instruction. And the last one, which I would say is one that, is very, very important, which somebody mentioned in the chat as well, is naming of specific brands. Particularly around suicide, we need to be so careful around naming specific brands for people to use. So if someone's doing a quick Google search, we don't want anything to come up that is going to give someone ideas of which pesticide they should take if they're intending in that moment to harm themselves. So just very last quick slide. So here, this is just jumping back to that article I shared at the start, just to show an example of that. So you'll see, I said Malaysia's deadly pesticide ban. I didn't name paraquat in the headline for that exact reason. Later down, it's buried further down, so it doesn't come straight away. I do talk about paraquat and the paraquat bans, but it's not there at the top being obvious. And like many of the articles you might have seen me posting examples here, we always include, when we're talking about suicide, the trigger warning at the top there and the link to an international helpline. So thank you very much for your time. Hopefully that's been helpful, just showing some of the examples. I should mention as well, we do actually also have a newsletter, so I'll post a link if anybody wants to join our mailing list as well, to get updates from us.
Thank you so much, Ellie. That was fantastic. I mean, I think, we sort of talked a lot about the kind of theoretical things about risk communication and then the government elements of it, and then to have it from the perspective of a communication specialist actually trying to take research and put it in a palatable way for a broader community. So real research translation. Thank you so much for that. And I just want to say thank you to everyone. We did a slightly different style this time where we had a lot more poll questions, a different way of engaging. So thank you for all your responses on the poll questions. We appreciate that. And as usual, or if you're not familiar, we always produce a digest. So there'll be a digest coming out. Make sure that you sign up for the community of practice. There also in the chat is the link to Ellie's newsletter. We also have a newsletter that is in the chat, as well as the link to the recording of this session and the slides. So if you would like those will be available at the link provided for you now in the chat. I also wanted to say thank you to Natasha in the background, who was managing and juggling very many poll questions this time. So thank you for that. There will be an evaluation that comes up when you leave the Zoom room. So please do take a moment. It's always important to get your feedback. It helps inform us about what we're doing and what we can always do better. There will be a discussion coming up in a week's time, so look out for messages that will be coming out. Oh, I forgot to do, sorry, we had no time for our sustainable messaging, risk communication. Maybe if you just go back with one poll, we were actually trying to see what would be some sustainable ways, and our apologies that we've actually run out of time for that. But we'll leave this up should you like to respond to that. We understand that if you have to leave. I'd like to say thank you very much to the presenters, to Nosiku and Ellie, of giving of their time and sharing so much information with us. And so if you have a moment and you would like to give some examples of risk communication approaches that you think could be sustainable and long-term. Thank you for someone who's indicated industry financing. We appreciate that. And we'll leave this up for a moment if you'd like to respond to that. And otherwise, I will say thank you and goodbye and enjoy the rest of your day or evening. Thank you.